Friday, the 17th of January. Welcome to the show. This is Business Morning. I am Bosin Amafaye, and we're live to you from Channel's global headquarters here in Lagos. It's been a very busy and eventful week, and we're wrapping it up today for you with the latest inflation data out of the Statistics Office showing Nigeria's inflation for the final month of 2019 reading 0.13% higher to 11.98%. That's just 2 notches below the expectations or forecasts from Financial Derivatives Company. The head of the company and a member of the Economic Advisory Council, Bismarck, Rewane, is joining us live this morning for some conversations to wrap up this week on these economic notes and give us some outlook of how this inflation data for the entire 2019 are all put together into Nigeria's economic outlook, and the new horizon for tax regime in the country is talking to us within the next few minutes. We're just trying to show you some of the headline figures from the inflation. That's the headline number, 11.98% reading. On a month-on-month basis, headline inflation was slightly lower on the right side of your TV screen, 0.85% below 1.02% in the previous month. On a month-on-month basis, check the food inflation. On a month-on-month basis, food inflation also came down very sharply from 1.25% to 0.97%. On a year-on-year basis, however, that's reading 14.67% for you. The cost-up index, however, went up on both on a year-on-year basis and on a month-on-month basis, and you can see the bold print, 9.33% and 0.81%. Look at the urban and rural index. These two indices also trended higher in the month under review on a year-on-year basis, 12.62% for the urban index and printing 11.41% for the rural index. In terms of states, governments, the states with the slowest rise in headline inflation, 3 state governments lead in terms of the slowest inflation. Edo State is a minus 0.03%. In other words, Edo State has the lowest inflation reading, minus 0.03%. Delta State, 0.08%, and Kwara, 0.19%. But those who are the highest inflation, food inflation is what you're looking at there at the month-on-month. Their basis highest in Sokoto, Ogun, and Plateau, but the food inflation on a month-on-month basis, highest Kogi, Kaduna, and Abia State. All of that will get a bit of a sense into that in a minute. So that's the big story this morning. But again, the issue around the eco-currency is also in focus this morning. Where are we as far as the decisions are concerned? Bismarck Rewane, let's bring him into this conversation. It's live from our studios in downtown Lagos at the Nigerian Stock Exchange. Mr. Rewane, good morning. Welcome to the program.
Good morning, Bosin.
Great. I almost said you were in London for the UK Nigeria Investment Summit. I'm sure that's a big showing of Nigeria next week. I'm sure that's a must-watch investment summit. If you had the opportunity of being there, I'm sure you would want to hear what the president and what the investment community will say about Nigeria. And I'm sure inflation is one of the stories that we'll have to deal with.
Yeah, inflation is a local phenomenon. So for those who are interested in international investments and all of that, good luck to them. But we need to deal with the domestic problems of inflation, which are pretty worrying, as you can see from the numbers that have just been announced.
Good. So if you drill down on the headline numbers for us very quickly, your forecast at FDC was 12% or so. This is just a few notches away from that. What was all that you forecast, and how do you think this figure was arrived at in terms of where do we have the heaviest in terms of the contributions to the headline number?
Okay, now, when you look at the headline inflation, which measures the basket this December with the basket last December, you would see that this is the 4th consecutive month that we've had an increase in headline inflation. But more disturbing is that if you take core inflation, which increased again, you find that core inflation defines inflation less seasonality. So if we decompose the causes of inflation this time, 1 was the border closure, 2 was an increase in money supply and lower interest rates, 3 was the payment of the minimum wage, and 4th was seasonality. So if you take all of these things into consideration, and you take away seasonality because core inflation is up, you take away the fact that minimum wage, not all are paid, then we begin to see that this inflationary trajectory is much more fundamental and something has to be done about it. And that we have to come to terms with the fact that in the month of January, even though normally in January is a slow month and people spend less and prices come down, we are going to witness an increase in the month of January, and the VAT effect will kick in from February 1st. So as far as we are concerned, we are in a high inflation environment and a low interest rate environment. So because money supply increase in October was only slightly above 2%, but more than 4% in November. So what you are having is money supply increasing, interest rates low, and inflation increasing. So the negative rates of return is now making consumers to consume more and save less. In that situation, you are likely to see the pressure building on inflation, and that is not a very comfortable position from a policymaker's perspective.
Yes, so when inflation goes up like this with so much liquidity, what happens to financial assets?
Well, they depreciate in value. Basically, because interest rates are low now, you are seeing that people are investing less, right, and consuming more. So the increased demand for goods is also pushing on prices. But don't forget that we've had a minimum wage effect, even in some states and the federal government. In case of the federal government, arrears were paid all the way to April. So what are we facing? We are facing a situation where something has to happen to change the consumption function of the Nigerian people on aggregate. That is for the entire country as a whole. The central bank is well equipped, and they have the MPC meeting on Thursday and Friday next week. So there's enough time to look at this and see what can be done. But even without waiting for the MPC to meet, through the tools and financial instruments, which is the open market operations activity, together with the Nigerian Treasury bills, we might begin to witness an appetite to change stance in favor of some tightening, just to ensure that inflation doesn't run away from us. Because once you have inflation above 12%, becomes growth retarding, and those are the words of the Central Bank of Nigeria. And we are at that point. We're already at 11.98 headline. But one thing you must know is that month-on-month inflation, though, declined, which means that because there was no border closure last year and there was border closure this year, because there was no minimum wage at this time last year, and so the impact of that, the base year effect, is also pushing on inflation. If you take the base year effects away, you can now see that month-on-month inflation, when annualized, comes at 10.85, which is not the same thing as 11.98. There's a big difference. So what it means is that you will have a spike in inflation in January, February, March. But after that, when output begins to increase and the VAT begins to suck money away from people, then you may see a tapering or moderation in inflation rates. So we are not pessimistic about the inflation trajectory, but in the short run, it's a cause for concern, both at the policy-making perspective, manufacturer's perspective, and investor perspective.
In terms of the food inflation index, read the tea leaves for us, Mr. Rewane. As far as food is concerned, we're not sure when the temporary land border closure will be revisited. It looks like, based on what the Minister of Foreign Affairs says yesterday about Nigeria First, he spoke about, on the backdrop of what Mr. President has spoken about, that Nigeria will not allow its neighbors to make a nonsense or, as it were, on domestic economic revival programs. So that looks like the land border closure will remain in place, at least for some time, foreseeable future, as we move along. So the food inflation, therefore, will have to deal with it. But again, the level of rice imports, according to NEPC, Export Promotion Council, shows that we're importing less rice than before. If we put all of this together, what's the inflation outlook from your end?
No, I think the border closure, no country can keep its border closed permanently. So the question of, we understand it was scheduled for January 31st, but that's being reviewed. There's a 3-country tripartite agreement that's being reviewed so that Benin, Nigeria, and Niger will have to come together to ensure that the neighbors respect our laws and we carry them along. So it's a collaborative effort. When the borders will be open, one does not know, but it cannot be closed permanently. However, we are going into planting season again. When there's planting season, there are shortages. And we are beginning to see cross-elasticity effect. The cross-elasticity effect means that if the price of one commodity increases, then the price of the substitutes will also increase because people will shift from the expensive one to the substitute. So we are beginning to see some pressure on gari and yam and other substitutes to rice, which is, from an aggregate demand, aggregate supply perspective, it's good that our farmers are now beginning to see some aggregate increase in demand. But the timeline or time lag between when the demand increases and when supply can be increased, right, is quite short. And therefore, what we are seeing is a negative effect. That is, rather than supply increasing, we are seeing price increasing. So generally speaking, the consumer is being confronted with stamp duty, VAT, increase in price due to border closure, increase in price due to cross-elasticity effect on the products or the price of substitutes. So in the short run, it's quite a challenging environment for the consumer. But in the long run, we think that the aggregate supply curve will shift, and therefore total output in the country will increase. But you cannot run a country based on that. Secondly, after a while, people find their way around the border closure. And I think if you look at the month-on-month inflation, it will suggest that some things are already beginning to slip back in. And so because you cannot, even in the United States with the border with Texas and Mexico and all of that, thousands of people are going across the border with all sorts of things. In Europe, people are crossing the Mediterranean. So strict border controls is almost an impossible, it's a mental abstract. It's almost impossible to achieve that because after a while, people will find their way around it. And what happens? The premium on the things that have come across the border become higher. And so one thing, compromised custom officials, some of them, consumers will be exploited, and the smugglers will have a paradise.
Within this same ECOWAS sub-region, Mr. Rewane, is where we have this conversation about the ECOWAS common currency between UEMOA and the WAMZ region, the French-speaking and the Anglophone country. The communique read yesterday was Nigeria rising to the occasion and calling everybody around the table and said, look, we need a special meeting of the ECOWAS heads of state and government and authority because what Ivory Coast did with France was not in tune with the spirit and intent of the ECOWAS members. What's your take?
Yes, now, you see, the thing about the ECO and the CFA is that the CFA has been there, even in name, it's been there since 1945. It's an acronym of French colonization. So first of all, let's deal with the fact that there's a change in name. But the only fundamental difference between the ECO and the CFA is that now the French countries don't have to keep their 50% of their reserves in Paris. Now, and also Paris will not have a direct, or they will still have an indirect influence on their monetary policy. But to me, it's a signal that currency convertibility in West Africa is only a question of time. But it cannot be done unilaterally, and I agree with the Nigerian position that the convergence criteria have to be met before you go into a new currency. So there's a customs union, there's convergence criteria, and then there's an emergence of a common currency. In Europe, it took about 15 years to do that, if not longer, between customs union and a common currency, the euro. So I don't think it is prudent, and I don't think it is in the interest of all policymakers and politicians that all of a sudden France and Ivory Coast and the French-speaking countries all of a sudden change the ECO. So to us, I think the change of name from the CFA to the ECO is symbolic, and it's a question of, it's a sound bite. But the reality is that whether we like it or not, currency, only 10% of the countries in the world practice multiple exchange rates. The time for currency convertibility will soon be here for everybody. And you you cannot be an outlier in the global currency market. And I think Nigeria made it clear that they are willing to move in that direction, but they are not going to be stampeded. They are not going to be stampeded into a decision that first of all, is not sustainable. Secondly, it will probably create more harm than good. And thirdly, we have other issues to deal with before we now begin to jump into a common currency, especially since those countries didn't have a central bank, they don't have a money policy, and then you can see they are more or less supported, and pampered countries as against Nigeria, Ghana, and the English-speaking countries who are independent and who have both political independence and economic independence. The French-speaking countries definitely, from what I see, have political independence, in quotes, but do not have economic independence. And we don't want to import their economic dependency into a country and a region which has been economically and politically independent over time.
How do you think this issue will be resolved, Mr. Rewane? Yes, we need currency convertibility. It has its advantages. But how do you think this issue will be resolved? We've been on it for about 20 years.
No, it will resolve soon. The global convergence of currencies and criteria are going to happen sooner than you think, because, you see, we are in a world of globalization. People will take their individual countries' interest. But the way we see it is that in the West African region, Nigeria is about 66% of GDP, about almost 70% of the population. Therefore, we are the largest market. What Nigeria wants, Nigeria gets. But we are the ones that will benefit from regional integration more than the other countries. So in terms of the geostrategic initiatives Nigeria is going to carry along, we cannot deny the fact that we will be heading towards currency convertibility. So we'll tidy up our own monetary policy domestically and then begin to look at global cooperation and collaboration. But don't forget, we have the African Development Bank elections coming up in May. And there are many things that are in play. So I think that we should look at the border closure, look at the eco currency, look at the ADB elections, and look at other things within the African regional context. Because it's not, you cannot take the eco currency in isolation. There are many things involved, including the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. So we have both at the Ministry of Finance and the Central Bank of Nigeria and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we are fully equipped and we have the people that understand this. And Nigeria has been at the forefront of the WAMSI arrangement. And so I don't think we are going to be bulldozed into things, but at the same time, we shouldn't be complacent, because sooner or later, there are two types of convertibility. There's current account convertibility and there's capital account convertibility. The difference between one and the other is about 5 years. So definitely, we will have to consider currency convertibility and tidy up our own internal currency arrangements. Our foreign exchange market and our foreign exchange rates will have to be much more consistent with our economic status. Sooner or later we'll come to that, but it's not an immediate problem for Nigeria.
This is the first time we're getting your views on the new finance law bill that was signed into law by Mr. President. What's your take on this economic tool of the Buhari's administration? Yes.
First and foremost, the VAT increased from 5 to 7.5%. Still, Nigeria is still has the lowest VAT in the region. And basically, we have state governments that are financially fragile, and they need to be able to meet their obligations under the minimum wage, and they need to meet their obligations under so many other things. So basically, what the Finance Act has done is to set the foundation for fiscal federalism and a higher level of fiscal discipline. The revenues accruing to the government will increase. The exemptions for companies that have turnover less than 25 million, and then those between 25 million and another figure, are only going to be paying 20% income tax rather than the high level. So net, the effective tax rate of Nigerian corporates have reduced. The effective tax rate on Nigerian consumers, right, has increased from 5% to 7.5%, but it's still lower than our regional partners. So when you talk about smuggling, we're just talking about the ECOWAS smuggling. If you have lower VAT rates in your country than the others, it's also a recipe for regulatory arbitrage and smuggling activity, because in the end, the price of a commodity will be the price of a commodity. But I want to make one thing clear to you, that because of this, the regional convergence criteria is that none of these countries must have fiscal deficit to GDP more than 3%. Today, it depends on how you compute it, we are at about 2.1 to 2.5%, but it could go higher if nothing is done about the revenue. So one, improve the base; two, improve the collection; and three, if possible, reduce the effective rates of corporate and personal income tax, while the taxes that are revenue accretive, like VAT, you now ensure that it is collected. There's work in progress in terms of how much of VATable goods are refunded or refundable, and how much of those exempted goods from VAT. How does this play out? But generally speaking, the effect of VAT will be inflationary in the short run, but in the end, because the state governments and the federal, and don't forget, the federal government only gets 15% of the VAT collected. It's estimated that we're going to be collecting about almost 2.2 trillion. Only 15% of that will go to the federal government, 85% will go to the states. And the states are the ones that are having problems paying salaries. The states are the ones that have viability problems. The states are the ones that have the ghost worker problem more than anybody else. So if we can ensure that they are well funded, one, and two, their expenditure has to be rationalized, because a lot of the states are.
Yeah, Mr. Rewane, thank you so much.
A lot of the states are also they've been spending too much money.
Mr. Rewane, thank you so much. We appreciate your time. A very elaborate conversation with you on some of the big stories so far this week. Thank you so much, member of the Economic Advisory Council and the CEO at Financial Derivatives Company and our economic counselor here on Channels Television. Thank you so much, Mr. Rewane.